What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week things are going to get a little dark as we're going to be creating an electric chair. Alright, let's just get started. So to start things off, I'm going to select the cube and start blocking out the main shapes. Now I'm going to focus on all the larger objects first, and then later on we can start getting into all the little details and adding all the small stuff. So let's just take our time and really just block this out slowly, just to make sure we get all those shapes right. Now this is definitely one of those models where it's going to look pretty awful for a while until I start getting everything together. So we're just going to focus on one side, block everything out, and then we can start moving on to all the fun stuff. So I'm just going to let this next little bit play out while I just block things out, and then we'll start getting into other things. And bear with me, I'm feeling a little under the weather this week, so I'm not going to be talking as much as I usually do, but once everything's blocked out, we'll start getting into it. Alright, so now that we have most of the shapes there, we're going to create our first little wire that goes right into this headpiece. So I'm just going to create that with a sweep mesh. So I'm going to go up to the create tab, create an EP curve tool. I'm just going to position those points where I want them, and I can go modify them afterwards and fit it into place. And once I'm happy with it, then I can just turn that into a sweep mesh. So let's go ahead and start moving these points around. So next up was creating those little rectangles that sit underneath the wrists. I'm not exactly sure how these work or if they have electricity running to them or not. Either way, they were in the reference image, so let's start creating it. I'm just going to select a cube and start blocking out that shape. So now we need a wire that's running all the way down the side to this little wrist piece. So just like we created the other sweep mesh for the head piece, we're going to create another one for this arm. So let's go ahead, create another EP curve tool, and we can start positioning these points into place. Alright, so it's slowly coming together. Next up is just creating those little staples or little clips that are holding this wire onto the wooden chair. So I'm going to go ahead and select the cube and start blocking that out. Now what I should have done is just UV'd this ahead of time before duplicating it a bunch. I just don't do it for the sake of the video, so I would recommend just UVing it ahead of time just to save yourself from doing the extra work. Alright, so now that that little staple is created, let's start positioning them over our wire that we created earlier. Alright, so now that those staples are in place, now let's just start refining the shapes a little bit before we start moving on to those ankle straps. Alright, so next up is doing those little cushions around the ankles. So to do this, I'm just going to duplicate that bottom piece we already created. That way I can highlight those faces around the ankles and extract them from the model so I have a shape that's already perfectly fitting in there. Then all I have to do is just extrude it, give it a little bit of thickness, and then I can hit 3 on my keyboard to smooth it out. And if I have to, I can add some supporting edges just to help that shape when I smooth it. So let's just go ahead and start playing around with these angle pieces. Alright, so that's looking good. Next up is creating those little leather straps that basically tie the person in. So to do this, I'm just going to create another little plane, just remove all those divisions so it's low and poly, and I can start positioning it on the side of my little cushion ankle strap. Now all I have to do is just select one of the edges and start extruding it to give it some length, and just think about how gravity would be playing a role in the type of material. Since it's a thick leather, it's probably going to help support itself when it hangs down, so I'm just going to start playing around with this shape until I get it into a position that I'm happy with. so now that we have that strap in position, before going ahead and extruding it and giving it some thickness, I'm just going to start beveling some other edges on the model, and then we can come back to this. Sometimes I like to just move on to another part of the model, that way it kind of gives me a fresh pair of eyes when I come back, and just make sure that I'm happy with the position of it before I finalize it. Alright, so now jumping back to that strap, I'm just going to duplicate it over to create the other side that it attaches onto. And all I have to do is just cut it in half because it's going to be a lot shorter than the one we just created. And once I'm happy with the position, all I have to do is highlight all of these faces and extrude it, and then give it a little bit of thickness. Alright, so next up is just those little tiny metal pieces that are on the side of the arm. Now I'm not exactly sure the reason for these, maybe it just helps hold the arm to the seat itself. Either way, it's in the reference, so we have to add it. Now these are really small, they're not going to be too obvious in the renders, so I don't have to spend too much time making them perfect. I just need a little tiny metal piece that looks like it screws in there. So let's go ahead and start blocking this out. So next up is doing those wrist straps, and just like we did the ankle ones, we're going to create another plane and start positioning those on top of the model. So let's go ahead and start blocking this out. Alright, the wrist straps are looking good. Now just before finalizing it, I'm just going to add a few small details to the model and I can come back to it after. So I'm just going to quickly jump to these other shapes and start beveling out some edges, and I can start adding a few small details like a few bolts, and to do that I'm just going to take a sphere, chop it in half, and I can start positioning them on the model. Now just to make my life a little bit easier for the UVing, I'm just going to quickly UV this bolt. So I'm just going to do a planar projection, Control U to unfold and Control L to lay it out. And now it's already prepped, so when I come back to it later on and I start duplicating these bolts, I just don't have to redo my work. Alright, things are slowly coming together. Next up is just creating those little buckles. So let's go ahead and start blocking those out. Now these buckles are pretty small, so I know in the renders you're not going to be seeing them too close up, so I'm not going to worry about getting them super high in poly and looking perfect. I just need something that roughly looks like the shape of a buckle. Alright, so the buckle's looking good. Now I'm just going to jump to that first strap we created so I can extrude it and give it a little bit of thickness. I'm also going to duplicate that same low poly strap before increasing those polys. That way I have another low poly shape that I can reuse for my other straps on the model. And we're going to do the same thing to the wrist strap. Alright, so the straps are looking good. Now let's just quickly jump to the back of the model so we can start working on some other shapes. Alright, so I created another EP curve tool and turned that into a sweep mesh. I just forgot to hit record, so luckily I caught it just in time. So I created this back thicker wire that's going to hold all of the smaller wires that are going from the top to the bottom. Alright, so now we're just going to jump to that first ankle strap I created. I'm going to select all of those objects and duplicate it over for the other ankle. Now I'm just going to take that lower poly strap that we duplicated over, and then I can start repositioning the strap so it looks a little bit different than the other one. I'm basically just going to redo the exact same steps we created for the first strap, and I'm just going to redo it for this one. The only difference is the strap's going to look a little bit different in position, just so it looks a little bit more realistic, because straps wouldn't be identical. Alright, so the ankle straps are looking good. I'm going to come back to them later on and keep refining, but they're good for now. What I'm going to do is just copy over that same lower poly strap we created, and I can start positioning it on the top of my chair to create those chest straps. So the exact same process we've been doing for all of these straps, just the only difference is going to be the top ones are going to be a little bit thinner and longer. So let's go ahead and start blocking those out. Alright, so the straps are looking good. I just want to add a few small extra details, so start duplicating a few extra bolts. So I'm just going to really quickly select all of these objects on the left arm and strap, and I'm just going to duplicate them over to the other side so I can have a better idea of how the model is looking. Now I am going to end up removing this. When I come to the UVing process, I'm going to UV one of these sides and then duplicate it over to save myself the work. The only reason why I'm doing this now is just so I have a better idea of how the model's looking, and I can start finalizing some of these shapes. Now, one of the things that stood out to me was this top headpiece. There's nothing really holding that metal piece in place, so we're going to create another cube and start blocking out a little metal strip that's going to be bolted on just to help support that shape. Alright, so that metal strap is in place. Now let's just refine the model a little bit more before we start adding a few extra things. Alright, so the model's slowly coming together. I thought it would just be cool to add a few extra small wires that were sticking out of this big cord that's going down the back of the model. So we're just going to create a few small cylinders and start positioning those right in the inside of this wire. So while looking online at a few of my references I was following, I saw a couple of them had those little metal pieces that were under the wrists, also behind the legs. And just looking at the model, I thought if I added those, it would also help fill in those empty areas. So we're going to go ahead and just duplicate that same shape we created that's underneath the wrist. We can start positioning those right below where the legs would go. And once again, I'm not exactly sure the reasoning for these. Maybe electricity is running to them, or the metal helps maybe shock the person. I'm not exactly sure, but I thought it would just be cool to add a few extra wires that were coming down the side, also running to these ones as well. So it's just gonna hopefully make the model look a little bit more interesting. So let's just duplicate that shape over and start blocking out those leg pieces. So I basically use that exact same curve we created for that first wire that runs down the whole top all the way down to that wrist piece. I just duplicated that same curve over and basically extended it a little bit longer to fit down the side all the way to that leg piece. So all I'm doing here is just repositioning this wire to fit a little bit closer to the model like the first one we did. And then I can just go ahead, duplicate one of those clips over and then start positioning those little staples or clips along the wire, just like we did to the first one. Alright, so that's basically it for the model. I'm just going to quickly fast forward and show you exactly how we did these UVs, and then we can start texturing. Alright, so here's the model in its finished form. I ended up doing 3 different textures. I have all the straps and the headpiece on one, and then the 2 wood textures as well. Now, I originally had just the 2 wood textures, but I decided to make a 3rd one for all the straps, just so I could have a little bit more higher resolution on those textures. Now, there's a few other small things I did. I added a few small dents to this helmet using the soft select brush, just moving those vertices around. And then I also just, with those leather straps, I made them look different from the right and the left ankle, just so they look just more natural. And that's basically everything. So let's jump over the Substance Painter so we can start texturing. So now jumping over the Substance Painter, I can go ahead and load in my FBX file from Maya. And once that's loaded in, take a quick look, and things are looking good, so I can go over to my texture set settings, scroll down to Bake Mesh Maps, and I can choose my output size. So I chose 4K, and then make sure to check on that little use low poly mesh as high poly mesh, since we're only having one mesh we're working with. And now let's go ahead and start baking out those textures. Alright, so we're going to start off with our texture 1, which is most of our wood materials, and then we can just copy the same wood material once we're happy with it to all of our other meshes. So let's go ahead to the Smart Materials tab, and I can start dragging on some of these wood materials to see which one I want to use as my base. So I was pretty happy with how this one was looking, so we're just going to open up that folder and start tweaking some of those settings. Now, I was originally going for a darker look, something that was a little specular as well, something along the lines of what you would see maybe in a video game, a little bit stylized but also realistic. Now, I end up changing this wood texture completely at the end. I thought something a little bit brighter and a little bit more colorful would be fitting, so I end up just going with this wood color for the longest time. At the very end, I end up changing that, which we will go over later on when that time comes. So let's just start tweaking some of these colors and settings till I get a wood material that's a little bit closer to what I had in mind. So I was pretty happy with that. So to add a little bit more detail on top of the wood, I'm gonna add another fill layer, and I can go to my masks tab and start dragging on a few masks to find a little bit of dirt or grunge I can add on top of the wood. And then once I'm happy with that wood material, at least temporarily, I can right click the whole folder, set that to a black mask, and I can select all the objects I want to assign that material to. Alright, so the wood's looking good. Next up is all the other little metal materials on this texture. So let's go ahead and start searching through those smart materials for a few other grungy, really worn out metal materials that I can fill in these other meshes with. Alright, so texture 1's looking good. Next up is moving on to texture 2. So I want to keep the same wood consistent throughout the whole model, so what I'm going to do is just copy, Control C that same wood material on texture 1, and I can paste it on my texture 2. So let's go ahead and start assigning that same wood material to my other meshes. Now here I realize those middle poles, because of the orientation they are on my UV map, the grains are going horizontal rather than vertical. And I want all those grains looking accurate like they would in real life. So what I'm going to do is just duplicate that same wood material over, open up that folder, find that wood grain texture, and then just change the rotation of them so they're running vertically, and then assign this material to those specific meshes. Alright, so the wood's looking good. Next up is just choosing a rubber material for all of these little wires. So let's go ahead and choose another smart material so we can fill in these meshes. Alright, so next up is finding a metal material to assign to those metal meshes in our texture 2. So let's go ahead and choose a few more smart materials to assign to those ones. And I'm going to go with that steel ruined material because it looks pretty grungy and dirty right off the bat, so it's pretty fitting. Alright, so for these two metal strips that go right into that headpiece, I want there to be a little like rivets or some sort of little indents that run along that tubing. So to do this, all I'm going to do is create a fill layer, go over to my textures tab, and I can go choose some sort of lined texture that I can apply to that height channel. And then all I have to do is just change the scale and tweak some of those settings to find something I'm happy with. And since all I really want out of this fill layer is that bump, I can just turn off all of my other channels so I only have my height applied to it. Alright, so we only have a few other meshes left on this texture, so let's go ahead and choose a few other materials to apply to these meshes. Alright, so now moving on to our last texture set, we're going to start off with that headpiece. Now I found this really nice rusty material on Substance Source on their website, and I just downloaded that and dragged that right into my library. So all I'm going to do is just assign that to the mesh and start tweaking some of those settings. I want to have that headpiece really rusty and looking a little beaten up. And I thought it'd be cool to actually have that border or the edge around the bottom of the helmet a little bit more rusty and a different material than the top piece. So while I was doing the UVs, I made sure to do some cuts around those edges. So all I have to do is just go to my UV fill and I can select all of those UVs I want to fill in this material. It just makes my life a lot easier, and if you plan out how you're doing your UVs, it can just make the texturing process a little bit quicker. Alright, so the metal headpiece is looking good, just that brighter metal is looking a little bit too clean, so I'm just going to add another fill layer, and I can go choose a different mask to add a little bit of extra rust on top of it. Alright, so the metal headpiece is looking good. Next up is moving on to those leather straps. So for the base, I'm just going to go over to the Smart Materials and choose a stylized leather look. It's nice and clean, it looks pretty good. All I have to do is add some nice wrinkles or folding effects on top of that. So to do that, I'm going to choose a different Smart Material. There's this creased leather material in the Smart Materials. And all I have to do is just copy out of that folder the creases, and I can paste them into this current one that we have applied to our leather. So let's go ahead and copy over those creases. And once I have those leather creases applied, all I have to do is just tweak some of those settings to make them more defined so they really show up on those ankle pieces. And once I'm happy with it, I can right click, set it to a black mask, and then assign it to all the meshes I want that leather material applied to. Now these leather straps need some sort of holes in them to actually like buckle in properly, and I didn't want to add that into the geometry to create some really high poly models, so I thought we'd do that directly in the textures. So to do that, I'm going to add another fill layer and just drag that height slider pretty low so there's a nice bump into the material, and then I can make it really dark black and then choose a little circle brush and start pasting on some holes where those holes would be inside of these leather straps. Alright, so the model's almost there. We just have a few other meshes to apply some materials to. And a lot of those are basically just metals. So we're going to find some more grungy, dirty metals, and we can fill in these meshes with these materials. Now I'm also going to be adding a few extra fill layers and some other masking effects just to make them a little bit more rusty and dirty around the edges and stuff. So let's just go ahead and start playing around with these materials, and we can fill in these last remaining meshes. Alright, so all of those meshes have materials applied, so now we can quickly jump into the renderer to see how things are looking. So all I'm going to do is just turn off that background image so I can have a closer look at these materials. And I'm just going to fast forward it a little bit to where I was finishing up these renders, and I noticed that the wood was looking just a little bit off. It was looking a little bit too plain in color. Everything was looking a little bit dull, and I thought it would look a little bit better to add some brighter wood materials to it. So I just quickly jumped back into my editor and I started applying some new materials. So here's the chair after I applied those different woods. I just chose a different smart material and just tweaked some of those colors to have a little bit of a brighter wood color. So as you can see here, I just turned off all the other woods. I kept them actually in the scene so you can see exactly what I did. But I just added a different wood material and I thought it looked a little bit more fitting. Now looking back, I obviously did like the darker wood as well, so I'm a little bit torn between the both, but I ended up going with the lighter one. I just thought, like I mentioned, it was just a little bit more fitting and brought a little bit more color to the model. So all I'm going to be doing here is just kind of jumping back and forth between the renderer and back into the editor just to see how things are looking. It always looks a little bit different once you're in the renderer with the proper lighting hitting those materials with all the reflections and everything, so you have to just jump back and forth to do those final little tweaks, but I just spend the next little bit doing that until I find something that I'm happy with. I also find this is usually the longest part of the whole texturing process, is at the very end when you're just doing those final tweaks. You can really spend quite some time, even hours, adjusting little things or adding extra little dirt and grunge effects over top and scratches and little details. So the end of the texturing process, in my opinion, is probably the most important, and the longer you spend tweaking things, the better results you're going to get at the very end. So let's go ahead and do some final little tweaks and then we can wrap it up. And that's basically everything. I just kept on tweaking some of these settings until I was happy with it, but that's basically the whole texturing and modeling process that I did to create this electric chair. I really hope you guys enjoyed this week's video, and if you did, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more weekly 3D content. If you'd also like to support the channel even further, as well as get access to additional content, check out my Patreon page, which I have a link in the description below. Alright, thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.